Welcome back to Allen Real Estate here at Century 21 Everest Realty. I want to take a minute in this episode and talk about a really important piece of a real estate transaction, which often can create a lot of confusion in a buyer or seller's mind and cause problems towards the end of the transaction and catch people unaware just because it's not something that they are often familiar with, and that is closing costs. A lot of the times I get the question of what are closing costs, who pays the closing costs, how can I reduce my closing costs, different things like that. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what closing costs are, because they are different depending on whether you're the buyer or the seller, and they can vary depending on the transaction and also depending on the state or municipality that you are in. So I want to cover them in general, and I'll probably do this in a two-part series. Right now I'm just going to cover the definition of closing costs and what they are, and then in the next series, or the next part of the series, I want to talk a little bit more about how those are incorporated into the price of the home and the negotiation process that occurs around those, because that can have a big effect on your success in making an offer on the home, which right now, as I've explained in my last episode, is a very strong seller's market, and oftentimes closing costs can be the difference between making or breaking your offer with a seller if you're the buyer. So let me take a minute and talk about what closing costs are. The basic definition of closing costs is that the cost of selling or buying a home. So we have our closing costs. They're called closing costs because they're typically paid at the close of the home. Also, there's a difference between buyer closing costs and seller closing costs. We have our buyer, a little smiley happy buyer here, and our seller. Okay, our buyer closing costs typically consists of a number of different things, and typically the buyer has a larger portion of selling or of closing costs because of a couple of things. One, the main part of the closing costs are typically related to the loan. So a loan origination cost is involved. There's credit application cost. So when you go to the lender, and again, most of this revolves around the lender, you go there, you apply for a loan, they check your credit, so they're going to do a credit application. There's going to be a small fee there. You're going to have underwriting fees as the underwriter checks your credit worthiness. You're going to have an appraisal fee, so an appraiser is going to come out and make sure that the value of the home is sufficient to cover the loan amount that the lender is going to give you. You're going to have other things like a home inspection. Now and a couple of these won't be at closing, but they're involved. You have a home inspection. You're going to have a title search fee for the title company to do a search to make sure that there are no liens or clouds on title. At the end of closing, there may be some recording or transfer fees in order to transfer the title of the home into your name so that it shows as you own it on the county records. There may also be taxes involved, either a sales tax, which typically the buyers are not dealing with, but maybe a transfer fee. Some areas, or whether it be an HOA, a city, or other entity, may require a fee to be paid whenever that home transfers ownership, and there may also be insurance premiums. In order to, you have to pay the initial premium or the initial payment for your home insurance in order for the lender to make the loan. So there's quite a bit of fees involved for the buyer as far as purchasing the home. And typically for a buyer, these range from anywhere to 3 to 4% of the cost of the home. Okay, so you can kind of count on that amount there. Just as a note, for example, the home inspection Often that is paid out of pocket before closing, but sometimes that can be recouped in the closing costs at closing, or you're given credit for that. And we'll again get to that probably in the second part of this series. For the seller, there are also closing costs, and a lot of sellers don't necessarily realize that, and some of them are blindsided by the fact that they have some costs outside of the commissions or marketing costs of the home at the close. And so those are the ones that typically get a little bit surprised about this. So for a seller, the typical fees are going to be your title and recording fees. So the seller also typically has some fees for the title company to transfer the ownership, or they split the cost between the buyer and seller for the title company to transfer ownership into the buyer's name. There may also be a sales tax involved depending on where you live. Not all states or municipalities have this. Fortunately, here in Utah, we don't have really a sales tax. There's going to be a property tax involved. Again, this may be shared and often is split and prorated between the buyer and the seller based on how long the seller has been in the home for the year versus how long the buyer is going to be in the home. So there may be a credit or a charge there to cover the property tax for that portion of the year. There's also possibly, depending on your situation and area, there may be an attorney fee involved for an attorney to review the documents and set up the contracts or whatever. Most of this, at least here in our state, is taken care of by agents who aren't attorneys but have the ability to use contracts and stuff, or set up the contracts that have already been pre-approved by attorneys. So a lot of that is included in the commissions. And a lot of time people don't consider the commission or the marketing costs as part of the closing costs. They often look at that as separate, just a part of selling the home. But again, these are credited and dispersed at closing by the title company, and so those are typically would be considered seller closing costs, but often it's mostly these fees here, the title fees, and also that would include the title fees, include the title insurance, the seller's policy that they pay for that covers the home should any cloud on title later come up and there be a dispute about the seller's ownership of the home or their right to sell the home to that buyer. So those are seller closing costs, which are always included. Okay, so now you have a little bit of the difference, the costs, and also the typically the cost for a seller is anywhere from 1 to 3% of the purchase price of the home, depending on which ones apply. Often around here I'm seeing between 1 and 2% here in Utah for sellers. A buyer, they may not have a lot of these closing costs if they're paying cash because there's no loan. So most of these fees that are associated with a loan won't apply to a buyer, and so their closing costs may be similar to the sellers as far as a 1 or a 2%, just again the title and the recording fees and the inspections and stuff like that, which aren't associated with a loan. So there you have it, the different closing costs that may be associated with whether you're the buyer or the seller. Now the question always comes up, particularly for my sellers: why do I have to pay the buyer closing costs, or do I have to pay the buyer closing costs? And this comes up a lot because when we do these transactions, a lot of the time the seller is paying the buyer closing costs, and then of course they're having to go out and buy a home and they're wondering, well, why isn't my seller that I'm buying my home from paying my closing costs when I had to pay the closing costs for my buyer? And there's confusion there on who's to do what or why and what's fair and that. I'm going to take a little time in the next part of this section to cover why and how we apply the closing costs and when it's a good idea to pay the buyer closing costs as a seller, and also when it's a good idea as a buyer to pay your own closing costs and not make the seller do that. if possible. So I'll talk about that in the next session. Thank you for taking the time to watch, and check me out on the next part when I talk about more about the negotiation processes and how the closing costs fit into that transaction. Have a great day.